In the heart of Egypt, there was a city dedicated to sun worship called also known as Heliopolis. It was there that Potiphar, a priest of prestige, a man of status and influence, lived. His daughter, Asenath, grew up in this religious environment, surrounded by temples, rituals, and traditions that exalted the Egyptian gods. From an early age, she was instructed in the mysteries of the sun deities, accustomed to seeing the political and religious elite circulating in her home. Her life, carefully molded for high society, seemed to be mapped out with no room for surprises. Asenath probably had access to the best education of her time. Her training included literature, music, etiquette, and above all, religion. As the daughter of a priest, she carried with her a kind of cultural and spiritual purity expected of her lineage. She was a woman of beauty and wisdom, viewed with admiration within Egyptian circles. Everything indicated that her destiny would be to follow in the traditional footsteps of a noble woman, to marry someone of similar lineage and perpetuate her family's legacy. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. But something in Asenath's story broke with this logic. Egypt was going through an unusual period. Pharaoh, disturbed by mysterious dreams, had elevated a foreigner, a Hebrew, to the position of governor. This man was Joseph, once a slave and prisoner, now master of the kingdom's decisions. And it was to this man that Asenath was given in marriage, not by personal choice, not by a passion cultivated over the years, but by royal decree. A union that, at first glance, united two irreconcilable worlds, the daughter of a pagan priest and the man who served the one God of Israel. Asenath's name appears briefly in the scriptures, almost as a detail. But behind her discreet introduction was a real woman with a past, culture, and identity. A woman who, without knowing it, was about to live a story that would completely change her trajectory and integrate her into the divine plan that guided the history of Israel. The stage was set. She didn't know it yet, but her encounter with Joseph would be more than an arranged marriage. It would be the beginning of a silent but profound transformation. Before continuing, I want to invite you to comment on which city or country you are watching from. Let's see how far this message is reaching. Joseph had hit rock bottom. Sold by his own brothers, he was torn from his land, from his father's house, and taken as a slave to Egypt. For a time, he served in Potiphar's house, where his integrity made him prosper. But even there, injustice caught up with him. Falsely accused by his master's wife, he was thrown into prison. For years, he lived in the shadows, forgotten, even though his faithfulness to God never wavered. It was in prison that the story began to change. God had given him the gift of interpreting dreams, and this ability took him out of his cell and brought him into the presence of Pharaoh. The king's dreams were disturbing, mysterious, and none of the wise men of Egypt could decipher them. Joseph, guided by God, revealed their meaning. 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of famine. But he did not stop at the revelation. He also presented a solution: to store food during times of abundance in order to survive times of scarcity. The impact of his words was immediate. Pharaoh saw in Joseph something he did not find among his advisors: discernment and divine spirit. Without hesitation, he elevated him to the position of governor, second in command throughout Egypt. From one moment to the next, Joseph left his chains behind to don fine robes. He received a ring, a necklace, a chariot, and a new Egyptian name, Zabanath-Paneah. As part of this new status, Pharaoh gave him a wife, Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. It was a political gesture, but also a symbolic one. Joseph was now part of the Egyptian elite, and his marriage to a woman of that lineage consolidated his position. For Joseph, who had always kept his faith alive, all this was not a personal achievement, but the fulfillment of a greater purpose. Each step of that climb, from the pit to the throne, was part of a divine plan that he did not yet fully understand. And now, as he welcomed Asenath as his wife, he knew that new challenges and lessons were coming. She, raised among Egyptian gods and rituals, and he, faithful to the one God, would form a home. A home that would become a symbol of something much greater than political alliances, a fusion of cultures, faith, and destiny. If this content is touching your heart, you can support this project by donating any amount by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. Your support helps me to continue telling these stories with dedication. When the Pharaoh gave Asenath to Joseph as his wife, few saw beyond the political gesture. In the Egyptian context, it made sense. A foreigner, even one elevated to governor, needed to be legitimized among the nobles, and nothing legitimized him more than a marriage to someone from the priestly class. Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, represented exactly that: prestige, lineage, and tradition. For the palace, it was a strategic alliance, but for God, perhaps it was something deeper, something that escaped human eyes. Joseph had endured trials that few could bear. From his youth, he had shown a heart sensitive to the divine voice. He had not been corrupted in Potiphar's house, nor in prison. And now, even in the face of power and wealth, his commitment to God remained firm. The marriage to Asenath was not his choice. It had been imposed on him. But his attitude toward it indicated a willingness to see purpose where others saw only imposition. For Joseph, every situation was an opportunity to reflect God's light. And living alongside a woman like Asenath, so distant from the faith of the Hebrews, was perhaps more than a challenge. It was a silent mission. Their union became, with each passing day, a space for coexistence between two distinct worlds. He, a servant of the one God. She, shaped by gods of stone and gold. But amid these differences, there was also fellowship, listening, and witness. Asenath, who had grown up among altars and incense, now saw up close a man who prayed to an invisible God, who did not bow down before images, who lived righteously even when no one was watching. And it was precisely in this contrast that the seed of something new could sprout. Perhaps Joseph never tried to impose his faith. His way of living, of treating others, of governing with wisdom and justice, spoke for itself. And Asenath, an intelligent and sensitive woman, began to notice. That union, arranged by the Pharaoh, began to reveal another side. It was not just a bridge between cultures. It was an opportunity for the truth to touch a heart that until then did not know the God of Israel. In the first days after the wedding, the Egyptian palace witnessed an unexpected coexistence. Joseph, the Hebrew faithful to the one God, and Asenath, daughter of the priest of now shared the same home. The union between them was official, but the differences were profound. Customs, beliefs, habits, everything separated them, and it was inevitable that these distinctions would begin to appear. Asenath, accustomed to the luxury and liturgy of the Egyptian gods, found Joseph's simple faith strange. There were no images in his chamber, no amulets hanging around his neck. He did not make libations or invoke the names of multiple deities. Instead, he spoke reverently of a single, invisible, personal God who did not dwell in stone temples but heard prayers wherever they were offered. For her, this was intriguing. Joseph did not seek the favor of the gods with offerings, but lived as one who was already loved by this God. His way of governing, his compassion for the poor, his justice in decisions, everything seemed rooted in a firm and silent faith. Gradually, what seemed strange began to arouse curiosity. Asenath observed more than she spoke. Every gesture of Joseph planted questions in her soul, but the process was not immediate. There was resistance within her. How could she deny everything she had learned since childhood? How could she question the path her parents had taught her? During silent nights, Asenath may have struggled internally with doubts and contradictions. Her heart, shaped by ancient traditions, was being confronted by a living, coherent faith that did not need imposing temples to be real. Joseph, for his part, did not seem concerned with changing Asenath by force. He did not preach, he did not accuse, he did not demand conversion. He just lived. His faith was not a discourse, it was a path, and that path, though silent, spoke loudly. Amidst Egyptian rituals and palace routine, something new was beginning to be born within Asenath. A restlessness, a desire, perhaps a thirst. That home, marked by the tension between two worlds, was becoming fertile ground for something unprecedented. The spiritual awakening of a woman who, without realizing it, was being touched by the presence of her husband's God. As time passed, Asenath's gaze no longer reflected only curiosity. There was a new thirst in them, a kind of emptiness that the Egyptian gods had never filled. Living with Joseph, his steadfast character, and the peace he seemed to carry even in the face of the heaviest responsibilities, awakened in her something that no ceremony in the Temple of Om had ever been able to provoke, a sincere desire to know the God of Israel. The Bible does not recount in detail what took place in Asenath's heart, but there are ancient traditions that shed light on this transformation. An apocryphal writing entitled The Story of Asenath, preserved in early Jewish and Christian circles, describes an intense journey of repentance and faith. According to this account, Asenath rejected the gods of her youth and secretly sought the presence of the one God with tears and fasting. She cried out for purification, renouncing the idols of her home, and asked to be received as a servant of the Most High. Although the text is not canonical, it echoes something that seems consistent with the reality of the time. For Joseph's children to be considered heirs to divine blessing, something would have had to happen in that woman's heart. Her transformation may have been silent, without fanfare, but profound. Coming from a pagan lineage, Asenath may have found, in the secrecy of her intimacy with Joseph, a new path, not only as the wife of a man of faith, but as a woman touched by God himself. Her habits would have changed. Egyptian practices gradually lost their meaning. Perhaps she began to pray to Joseph's God, not with repeated formulas, but with simple and sincere words. Perhaps she asked him to see her, to accept her, to make her someone new. And like so many other stories of faith in the biblical narrative, this plea may have been heard. Thus, Asenath, once a symbol of a distant culture, became part of God's redemptive plan. Her life, once shaped by stone altars, was now integrated into the eternal purpose that accompanied Abraham's lineage. And from this transformed womb would be born two sons who would carry promises, Ephraim and Manasseh. The new phase of Asenath's life was established with motherhood. Amid the years of abundance that preceded the famine in Egypt, she gave birth to two sons. The first was named Manasseh, and the second, Ephraim. These names, chosen by Joseph, carried deep meanings, reflections of his journey of pain, restoration, and hope. But more than symbolic names, those boys represented the continuity of a covenant, the link between a wounded past and a redemptive future. Asenath, now a mother, carried in her lap not only two sons, but two seeds of divine promise. Raising them alongside Joseph was more than a domestic task. It was a spiritual mission. The home that had once been divided by cultures now became fertile ground for the formation of men who would later be counted among the tribes of Israel. The biblical text recounts that at the end of Jacob's life, Joseph's two sons were adopted as if they were his own. Ephraim and Manasseh received blessings that placed them side by side with the other patriarchs of the tribes. This indicates that something extraordinary had happened. Despite their mother's Egyptian origin, they were fully welcomed into the lineage of Israel. This would not have happened without the spiritual influence that Joseph cultivated at home and that Asenath somehow welcomed and passed on. We can imagine Asenath teaching her children about a God who had no face but who was present in history, a God who had kept her father in foreign lands, who had turned pain into honor, imprisonment into government, and now gave a new destiny to the next generation. Those boys, though born on Egyptian soil, learned early on to carry a distinct spiritual identity in their hearts. Motherhood for Asenath was more than a natural calling. It was part of her redemption. In her arms grew children who would not only be leaders in Egypt, but heirs to the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this definitively sealed her inclusion in the history of God's people, not as a spectator, but as an active participant in the legacy. The union between Joseph and Asenath at first glance seemed like a purely human decision, a political choice by the pharaoh, motivated by social and diplomatic conveniences. But as the story unfolded, it became increasingly evident that something greater was at work. It was as if, behind the actions of men, the finger of God was silently moving the pieces of a much deeper plan. Joseph did not seek out Asenath. He did not choose her out of passion or interest. She was given to him as part of the package of his rise to power. Yet he did not reject this woman, even though she was the daughter of a pagan priest. Instead, he welcomed her, lived with her, and, by all accounts, loved her. But why would God allow such an upright, set-apart man to unite with someone who came from a background so far removed from faith? This question echoes in many hearts to this day. Why would God, so zealous for his holiness, allow such an unlikely alliance? The answer may lie in the very essence of divine action. God is not limited by human categories. He sees beyond origin, culture, and appearance. He sees the heart, and he can use even unlikely alliances to fulfill his eternal purposes. In biblical history, it is not uncommon to see God choosing paths that scandalize religious logic. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, all women who at some point seemed to fall outside the expected norm, but who were included in the lineage of the Messiah. With Asenath, the same may have happened. God not only allowed her to enter sacred history, he used her to continue the promise. Perhaps the great lesson lies precisely there. What seemed to be only a human choice became part of a divine plan. Joseph, even in a foreign land, was an instrument of redemption. And Asenath, even coming from idolatry, was reached. Their children, the fruit of this union, were elevated by God to positions of honor among his people. What seemed like a contradiction turned out to be an expression of grace. God once again showed that his ways are not our ways, and that he is able to transform human alliances into bridges for the fulfillment of his will. Asenath is one of the most enigmatic figures in the biblical narrative. Her name appears only a few times, and always briefly, almost technically, as Joseph's wife, Potiphar's daughter, mother of Ephraim and Manasseh. No words of hers are recorded, no actions are described, no prayers are mentioned. The Bible, so rich in details about other women, chose silence in the face of her journey. And it is in this silence that something precious is hidden. What God silences, he also reveals in other ways. The absence of words about Asenath does not mean an absence of purpose. Quite the contrary. Sometimes it is in absence that God invites us to look more closely, to perceive the subtle contours of a story that does not need to be explicit to be transformative. The fact that she was integrated into the lineage of God's people, even without a long account, already says a lot. Her name, though discreet, appears at decisive moments. When Joseph is elevated to power, when the children are born, when Jacob blesses them, there is Asenath, silent but present. Her influence is not measured in speeches or public deeds, but in the fruits she bore. Ephraim and Manasseh were not only the sons of a pious man, but also of a woman who, in some way, embraced the faith that Joseph lived. It is possible that the silence about Asenath was a form of protection. At a time when her pagan origins could have led to rejection, the focus remains on the grace that came upon her. Her presence in the narrative is subtle but firm, like someone who enters through the back door and remains at the center of the story without drawing attention. Furthermore, silence opens space for contemplation. How many women throughout history have felt forgotten, erased, irrelevant, and yet how many of them, like Asenath, have marked generations through faithfulness in anonymity? Her story teaches us that it is not necessary to be in the spotlight to be used by God, that the impact of a life is not measured by visibility, but by depth. Asenath reminds us that God does not forget those whom the world does not mention. And even without recorded words, her life echoes to this day, like whispers of faith coming from the silence of Scripture. Asenath was born into a world completely alien to the God of Israel. From childhood, she had been surrounded by temples, rituals, and gods made by human hands. Her identity was deeply rooted in Egypt, in its culture, religion, and position as the daughter of a priest. Nothing in her background indicated that one day she would be part of the history of the chosen people. But God, in His grace, does not consult the past to define the future. Asenath's transformation did not come by imposition or merit. It was the result of a silent encounter between her thirsty soul and the living faith of a man who trusted God completely. Joseph not only shared his life with her, he shared his hope, his purpose, his trust in the God who had turned his own pain into a blessing. And this coexistence gradually redrew the course of Asenath's history. She couldn't change her origins. She couldn't erase the beliefs she once practiced, but faced with the truth, she was able to choose a new path. She was able to let go of what she knew, to embrace what she was beginning to believe. And in that silent choice, God received her, redeemed her, and inserted her into something much greater than she ever imagined. Asenath's past, though real, was not her final destiny. And that is what makes her story so deeply human and divine at the same time. She represents all those who were once far from the covenant, but who, by grace, were reached. Her life is a symbol that faith is transmitted not only by words, but also by coexistence, by testimony, by constant love. As the mother of Ephraim and Manasseh, she became a vital part of Israel's spiritual genealogy. Her sons carried the promises, inherited blessings, and influenced generations, and through them, her story lives on. A woman who, even coming from a pagan past, became God's instrument to build the future of a people. Nothing was by chance, not her birth, not her marriage, not her silence. Everything cooperated so that, in the end, her life would prove a powerful truth. With God, no one is stuck in the past. He transforms stories, He redefines destinies, and He often chooses those whom the world would never choose. The story of Asenath is like a pearl hidden in the field of Scripture. Discreet, almost silent but deeply revealing. Her life leads us down an unexpected path, the path of transforming grace, welcoming love, and faith that is born even in unlikely environments. She shows us that God is not limited by our traditions or expectations. His actions transcend borders, cultures, and pasts. The first powerful lesson we learn from Asenath is that one's origin does not determine one's destiny with God. She was born into idolatry, but she was brought into the history of God's people through faith and grace. This reminds us that no one is beyond the reach of the Lord, no matter what one's past choices, or family background may be. When God enters one's life, everything can be transformed. Another lesson is that silent witness has power. Joseph did not force his faith on Asenath. He lived with integrity, consistency, and love, and his life gradually awakened a spiritual hunger in her. Today, we are called to live that way too. Our actions, our words, our decisions, everything can be a reflection of who God is, and through this, hearts can be touched. We also learn that God uses unlikely alliances to fulfill His eternal purposes. The marriage between Joseph and Asenath, in human eyes, seemed out of place, but in God's hands it became an instrument of blessing, continuity, and legacy. In the same way, God can use situations we don't understand, unions, encounters, unexpected paths, to accomplish what He has always planned. Finally, Asenath's story invites us to believe in the redemptive power of faith. She didn't have to be perfect. She just needed to open herself up, and that tells us how accessible the Christian faith is. It is not by merit, it is by grace. Transformation is possible, even for those who carry a past of estrangement. May everyone who hears this story know that with God, the past does not define the future, and faith can be born in the most unlikely places. If you liked Asenath's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.